Hey there, welcome back. This is Felix from Goldammer Vintage Watches. Today's video is all about watches and water. So imagine your watch has a water resistance rating of, let's say 100 meter. Does that mean you can dive with this watch without any problems? How water resistant are vintage watches? How does the weather affect water resistance? And what's the difference between waterproof and water resistant? Have you ever asked yourself these questions? Today we will clarify all of this, guide you through the evolution of water-resistant cases and show you the balance between enjoying a watch and not ruining it. Let's start our today's video with the question, how water-resistant are vintage watches? What we talk about in this video may be elementary for some of you, but for everyone else it will surely help you avoid ending up with a rusted watch, bad mood and an empty wallet. If you are a seasoned collector or simply dip your first finger into the vintage watch soup, you've surely asked yourself at least once whether you could wash your hands, shower or even swim with it. Like always, there is no right or wrong answer. As vintage watches have passed through different owner hands and sometimes have an obscure past in history, you definitely have to know about its resistance to water. Watches are opened and serviced by different people, altering the gaskets and hence the water resistance. One way to make sure that your timepiece is ready for a swim is simply to take it to your trusted watchmaker. First things first, many people think that water is a public enemy number one when talking about vintage watches. But that's not always the truth. To understand why, we have to clarify what means vintage in the first place. Vintage is generally accepted as being anything over 20 years old. So if your watch is older than 2002, it can be considered a vintage watch. With this classification in mind, there have been some perfectly capable water-resistant watches circulating around since the late 90s, which, with a perfect service history, should perform in the water just as well as they did when they were new. Vintage watches can be water-resistant, up to their original resistance. However, the further back in time you go, the less true this becomes. For watches prior to the 60s, water is an absolutely no-go. There's a very simple main reason for this, the so-called gasket rings. Screw-down case backs, like for example in Omega Constellation cases, that we assume or associate with water resistance, only fills half the equation. It provides the pressure needed to seal the watch, but still needs a seal. This seal comes in the form of less tiny rubber rings that adjust when pressure is applied from the case back or crown to seal any gaps between the inside and the outside of the watch. Due to changes in pressure and various other reasons such as temperature, they simply lose their shape and starting to corrode, making it impossible for the case to remain water resistant. Many vintage watches have these rubber rings and claim to be water resistant, but they don't have screw-down crowns and case backs. A snap-on case back, like on this IWC for example, does not even come close to generating the necessary pressure on the rubber ring to hermetically seal the case. And of course, the same goes here for the crown. Any watch that wasn't specifically advertised as a diving watch is potentially not fit for any water impact. Look for the diver marking hints or depth rating inscriptions on dials or case backs. For these reasons, even with properly cared and serviced vintage watches, we strongly recommend keeping vintage watches dry and away from water as much as possible. Think twice and be mindful if you wear it on hot summer days while sweating, rainy days, or even steam, like pouring water into a cup of tea or coffee. The second point we would like to explain today in short is the history of waterproof cases. The original best-known pioneering wristwatch that could withstand a wet environment was a famous oyster-cased Rolex worn by Mercedes Gleitze when she swam the English Channel in 1927. Not to forget the Omega Marine dating back to 1932. But in the early 20th century, nobody really cared about water-resistant watches. But this changed during the technical revolution in World War II when water-resistant watches became a must-have. In fact, the Allied forces asked manufacturers to come up with watches that met all their specifications. Only 12 Swiss companies were able to produce these timepieces, and they were later named the Dirty Dozen by collectors. These pieces had met the specs you would expect a military watch to be: waterproof, luminous, regulated to the chronometer level, and composed of a case that was rugged. Of course, this military jagular culture from the 1940s was not part of the Dirty Dozen, but it is very close to its design aesthetics. So let's head over to our third question. What does the water resistant rating on our dials really mean? After the Second World War in the 1950s and 60s, the race for depths of the ocean pushed mechanical engineers and watchmakers to develop technologies that had to follow divers into the dark abyss of the world, down to 20, 100, 1,000, 3,900 meters, and so on. But for what those numbers written up on your watch stand up in real life? You may have came across different terms like meters, bar, or ATM used to indicate water resistance of the watches. Contrary to common belief, a 3 bar, 3 ATM or 30 meter water resistant watch does not mean it can be taken to water depth of 30 meters, but rather that your watch will resist rain, snow and splashes. In fact, watches are tested most of the time in labs and rarely in real conditions. So the meter indication on your watch dial don't necessarily represent the reality. In a real diving situation, your watch isn't static. Every movement you make underwater puts pressure on the case, glass and also the crown. A 5 bar ATM or a 50 meter watch could withstand splashes, shower and is suitable for swimming. It is not suitable for water sports, poolside diving and sea diving. The 10 ATM/bar or 100 meter mark is where you can start to slowly discover your underwater surroundings, meaning snorkeling, water sports and light diving up to 5 meters deep. With 20 ATM/bar or 200 meter, your watch is ready for swimming, high impact water sports and even scuba diving. With more than 30 ATM/bar or 300 meter inscribed on your dial, you'll be fine for all high impact water sports, scuba diving and saturation diving. So let's answer our last question for today. What's the difference between waterproof and water resistant? The terms are often used interchangeably, despite not meaning the same thing at all. You may notice that luxury watches are rarely labeled as waterproof. Instead, they have a label on the watch dial indicating water resistance and a number of meters. This is because no watch is truly waterproof. Yeah, you can say the term waterproof is a lie. Actually, the term waterproof has been made illegal for commercial use in the United States. Manufacturers have to use water resistant instead, a more vague denomination. The difference between water resistant and waterproof lies in how much water a watch can handle before breaking. Waterproof implies that a watch will never leak under any circumstances. But the truth is that if you put enough water pressure on it, any watch will leak. That doesn't mean that near waterproof watches don't exist. Rolex Oyster Perpetual Deep Sea Challenge, for instance, has been proven waterproof up to 12,000 meters. But even those watches are susceptible to the aging process and extreme conditions. It would be unreasonable to assume that a product made of physical materials could not, in some way, be affected by its physical surroundings over time. So that's all for today. We hope you enjoyed this topic as we do. So have a great day and hope to see you in our next video.